Thanks very much for coming. This is it's not the first talk I've done this year. I've already done, I think, 7 this year. So it's been a busy start to the year, which has been really nice. But until I gave a version of this talk yesterday evening, I hadn't hosted one of my own. So this is nice. It feels like the first one that I've hosted this year. So it's great to see you all. It's been quite popular, this talk, more popular than I was expecting it would be. So I'm feeling the pressure a bit to do you a good talk today, but I hope you enjoy it. So we're going to be talking about Amenhotep the First. This is a story, if you like, that is one of the ones that's in my book, Searching for the Lost Tombs of Egypt. So I come to know the story through my research for the book. In this case, it's not a sort of situation where we don't have a tomb, but we have fragments of evidence, as we do in some of the other, the case of some of the other individuals in the book, people like Cleopatra, Alexander the Great. We know sort of what we're looking for, but there's no trace of it archaeologically. In this case, there are several candidate sites for the tomb of Amenhotep. 3 different tombs have been claimed to belong to Amenhotep I. And there is a project which we're also going to look at, which believes that none of those are the true tomb of Amenhotep I, and that it should be sought in a different place altogether. So we're going to look at 4 different possible locations and the evidence, and at the end we can come to our own conclusions about which, if any, of these is most likely to be the one. When I was putting the books together, you may have heard me say things like this before when I've been talking about other tombs. When I was putting this book together, it felt like a very not exactly obvious book to write, but it was a book that I realized once I started talking to a publisher about the possibility of doing a book. I realized that I'd been gathering about 3/4 of the ideas for this particular book without really realizing it, and this was one such case. I'd worked in this sort of area that we're going to be focusing in today in Luxor for a few years, and I was aware of several different projects and theories and ideas around the whereabouts of the tomb of Amenhotep I, and also of people who were still looking for it. And in that regard, it was kind of perfect for the book. It's exactly what I wanted, really, was tantalizing clues, a good backstory about an ancient individual, and an ongoing project that would allow me to sort of finish my chapter by saying, watch this space, you never know what might be found. So let's start off with a bit of historical background. We are looking today at an individual from the early 18th dynasty. So he comes in here, second king of the 18th dynasty, and the 18th dynasty also, of course, ushers in this new great phase in Egyptian history, which Egyptologists have come to call the New Kingdom. It begins with the final defeat of the Hyksos kings, the 15th dynasty line of kings, who had come to settle in the Delta region and to take control of the Delta and a chunk of the Nile Valley, the northern Nile Valley, including Memphis. It's not entirely clear how far south their influence extended. But the boundary was probably somewhere in Middle Egypt. There may have been a kind of no man's land in between the Hyksos kingdom and that of their great rivals, the 17th dynasty kings. So the second intermediate period, which is the name we give for this chunk of time before the New Kingdom, is one of those times when, rather than Manetho's dynasties following one another, they actually overlapped a bit. So the 17th dynasty and the 15th dynasty kings were ruling alongside one another. The 17th dynasty line based at Thebes, the 15th dynasty based at Avaris, which has been identified at the modern day site of Tel Adaba, where an Austrian mission is still working now under Irina Forstner-Müller, but for a long time, for many, many years under Manfred Bietak. So yes, it's the 17th dynasty king's final triumph over the Hyksos, an expulsion of these kings from the Delta that brings about the reunification of the country, the start of the 18th dynasty, and also the start of the New Kingdom. Amenhotep is not quite the first king of this period, he's the second, but he's right in there at the beginning of it. Just to give you some of the names of the people involved, some of these at least are going to crop up quite a bit in this talk. The best known of the 15th dynasty Hyksos kings are probably the last three in this list: Hian, Apophis, sometimes Apep, and Kamudi. And then their rivals in the 17th dynasty, as you can see, by the way, the 16th dynasty line is composed of, as it says here, numerous ephemeral kings and wholly contemporary with other dynasties. We don't know very much about the 16th dynasty, but they don't seem to have had a great impact. The story is really one of the rivalry between the 15th dynasty kings in the north and the 17th dynasty kings in the south. We're going to be looking actually briefly at the tombs, or what we know about them, of some of the kings of the 17th dynasty. The best known of these are the ones, again, at the end of the line, in particular Seqenenre Ta'a, who we know very well engaged the Hyksos in battle. His mummy is one of those in the Egyptian Museum, which appears to exhibit evidence of some very severe injuries, which has led people to speculate that these might have been suffered in battle, and that he might actually have died at the hands of the Hyksos. We can't be sure about that. Kamose, his successor, is the king who we know from several versions of a lengthy historical text is the pharaoh it seems to have decisively defeated the Hyksos. Even though, according to Manetho, the 18th dynasty in the New Kingdom doesn't begin until the reign of his successor, Ahmose I, Kamose is the one best known, for having engaged them in battle and won a decisive victory. The Hyksos, by the way, the word Hyksos is a Greek form of the Egyptian Hekar Karsut, which just means ruler of foreign lands. So it's a bit vague. You could apply the phrase ruler of foreign lands to any number of different individuals and groups that had an influence in Egypt, but it comes to mean this 15th dynasty line. We don't exactly know where they came from, but they most probably had their origins somewhere in the Levant region, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the area that's now Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, somewhere there. They are depicted, or a related group at least is depicted quite famously in the tomb of Amenhotep II at Beni Hassan. This is a 12th dynasty tomb from the Middle Egyptian cemetery. You might know this scene. These three hieroglyphs here are actually the phrase Hekar Karsut. The crook stands for the word Hekar, ruler. In this case, this little triangular sign is a dotted K, which is a phonetic complement, so it's also part of the word Hekar. And then this is the word, or it's the sign that stands for the word Karsut. This is thought to represent mountains. So for the Egyptians, these mountains represent a kind of far distant land, a foreign place, in other words, somewhere far away. So this is a ruler of foreign lands, and we know his name here. It's written down in the corner. This is Ibshar, and he is a Hyksos, if you like, and he's depicted clearly as being somebody foreign. We can tell that from probably quite stereotypical representation of somebody from Asia in very general terms, somebody who might be called Asiatic. He's got a very elaborately decorated garment on here, very un-Egyptian in style, and he has an un-Egyptian hairstyle, and he wears a beard, as does his colleague over here as well. All very much a sort of highly stylized way of showing that these are foreigners. So the Hyksos were possibly related to individuals like this. Incidentally, in this context, these are not aggressors at all. These individuals are in Egypt, and they are simply bringing tribute or gifts as part of a long sort of scene of such things for the owner of the tomb. But there's no sense that there's any animosity between Egypt, represented by Amenhotep, and these foreigners at this point. But these nonetheless may be related to this group that eventually came to take over the north of the country and to become opposed, therefore, to the Egyptians in the south. So here we are, 15th and 17th dynasties. The end of this period ushers in the 18th dynasty, which begins with Ahmose I, who we see on the left-hand side here. And he's followed by Amenhotep I, the subject of our talk today, who we see on the right-hand side. Both images are quite similar, as you'll see, both kings wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt and uraeus at the brow. I'm not absolutely sure how certain we are that Ahmose I is the king depicted on the left. I'm not sure if it's inscribed or if there's some other way of telling who this is, but it's thought to be Ahmose I, and the same applies to this image of Amenhotep I. We don't know for sure that this is him, but on stylistic grounds, we think it probably is. So these are our first two kings of the reign. And before we look at the tomb of Amenhotep I, I just wanted to note that we also don't know the whereabouts of the tomb of Ahmose I. So I wasn't in my book intending to discuss every single tomb of a king that we haven't yet identified or haven't yet found. What I was doing was looking for such tombs about which there was a story I could tell. And what I was always looking for was the story of an ancient person, a good evidence for the location of the tomb, which I could discuss, and ideally one or more archaeological projects that had spent time looking for it, which would allow me to tell a story as well. There isn't so much of that in the case of Ahmose I, so there wasn't really very much to say. Certainly not as much as there is for the tomb of Amenhotep I, but it is just worth noting, just in case anybody was thinking, hang on, I don't think we've got the tomb of Ahmose either. You're quite right. What we do have, though, which is quite intriguing and not irrelevant to the story of Amenhotep I, is some kind of funerary complex, which is not in Thebes, which is where we're going to spend the majority of our time today, but at Abydos. And I'm apologizing here for the quality of the images, but these are, I hope, will give you the sort of basics of what we have at Abydos. If you look at the plan on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that there's a string of monuments in a line running roughly from the desert edge. So this line represents the edge of the cultivated land on this side, the Nile Valley, and the desert on the other side. We have a pyramid. It doesn't really have the appearance of a pyramid, particularly now, because it's quite denuded. It was constructed of a rubble core with solid stone on the outside, quite typical of pyramids after the great era of building them very, very solidly in the 4th dynasty. And the stone on the outside has been robbed away, and what you're left with is a rubble core, which over the centuries has worn away and collapsed. So it doesn't have a very triangular shape anymore. It has more of a sort of flattened lump shape. And in this case, there's actually a kind of a rut in the middle. So it looks a bit more like two hills. The photograph on the right is from a visit I made a few years ago with a group. And they are, in fact, climbing up, if you like, the pyramid here. And this is this sort of dip in the middle that they're walking up. None of them were aware that they were climbing a pyramid until we got to the top and told them at the time. So it certainly doesn't have the appearance of a great spectacular pyramid, but it would have been a very sizable, significant monument. And it is attached to a shrine here of, interestingly enough, Ahmose's grandmother, Teti Sheri. Then what's labelled here as a tomb, and then finally a terraced temple, which is right at the bottom of the the point at which the low desert, the sandy desert, gives way to the steep slopes of the cliffs leading up to the high desert. So these are not quite mountains in the normal sense, but they're referred to as mountains in the Egyptian context, and the temple's right at the base of those. Any of you who have visited the tomb of Senusret III at Abydos, and I think some of you will have done with me on trips in the last few years, this sequence of monuments is a little way to the it's not south because the river isn't quite running north-south at this point. It would be to the east. If you imagine that the river's running north-south at this point with the mountains to the west, it's a little way sort of below this on the map, if you like. And so the temple terrace is a little way along the bottom of the mountains from the tomb of Senusret III, not very far away. What's labelled a tomb may or may not have been a tomb. As you can see, it's composed of a cutting into the ground and then a winding corridor which descends deeper and deeper, and at a certain point opens out into this columned hall before continuing into the rock and taking a kind of curved turn like this. The reason we're not really clear whether it's a tomb or not is that very little, or basically nothing, was found in the tomb to suggest that anybody was ever buried here, and there's no decoration to give it its true function away. But in all other respects, it looks very much like a tomb. It clearly is part of this sequence of monuments, which was constructed by Ahmose I. Dedicated to Ahmose I, but also to Teti Sheri, his grandmother. If we had clear evidence of a burial, then this would be an open and shut case. This is the tomb of Ahmose I and possibly also of Teti Sheri. But it's anomalous in that all of the royal tombs, the tombs of pharaohs prior to this point, and all of the tombs, as far as we can tell, after this point, are all in Thebes. Ahmose I is part of a Theban family, the 17th dynasty line, and as we'll see, his predecessors are all buried in that area, and of course into the New Kingdom. Certainly once the Valley of the Kings gets underway, whenever that happens, his successors are all buried in Thebes as well. So it would be highly unusual for somebody to just choose to go and be buried somewhere else. So based on the absence of evidence of a burial and the fact that this is anomalous, it's more often claimed that this is a kind of proxy burial, or a cenotaph. Cenotaph is a better word, kind of a dummy burial. So it's a funerary monument at Abydos, which is the cemetery par excellence associated with the cult of Osiris and the cult of Wet-Wawet, both funerary deities. It's the great place of pilgrimage and established as such by this point. And we know that other kings also built funerary type monuments that were not their tombs. So the Temple of Seti I, for example, is a very good example of that. It appears to be a kind of cenotaph funerary monument of Seti's. His tomb is in the Valley of the Kings. His mortuary temple is in Luxor, associated with his tomb. But he built a funerary monument there at Abydos as a way of associating himself in death with the Lord of the Underworld. So it's claimed that this is the same thing. But in the absence of any clear evidence for his tomb anywhere else, it is actually possible this is what we're looking at. But the association with Teti Sheri in some ways is the most significant part of the pyramid complex for the story of Amenhotep I. Teti Sheri was the wife of Pharaoh Senachtenre. I'm sorry, I've misspelt this here. Senachtenra. The mother of Seqenenre-Tao, the pharaoh who engaged the Hyksos in battle and whose mummy exhibits these injuries that people have interpreted as signs that he was killed in battle by the Hyksos. Seqenenre-Tao is the father of Ahmose I, and therefore Teti Sheri is his grandmother. And this little mud shrine is very much a part of the pyramid complex. And it's in the shrine that this stela, I'm sorry, it's cropped in the photo I was using from Mark Lehner's Complete Pyramids, but you get the idea anyway. A very fine stela showing Ahmose himself, here he is, at the left-hand side wearing the white crown, Nebekti Ra Yachmez, paying homage to his grandmother, Teti Sheri, who's shown here, seated and with her name written in a cartouche above her, Teti Sheri. Hempt Nesu, the wife of the king, Mut Nesu, the mother of the king, Teti Sheri. So she clearly occupied a very, very prominent part played a very prominent part in Ahmose's life. Perhaps more important than any other woman, apparently, in his life. This is very intriguing, partly because something similar repeats in the time of Amenhotep I. In his case, it's his mother, Ahmose Nefertari, who appears to have played an incredibly important role. We see her here in a painting which comes from a Theban tomb but is now in the Neues Museum in Berlin. So she's the wife of Ahmose I, mother of Amenhotep I, but they again seem to have had this very close relationship. It may be that Amenhotep I came to the throne as a very young man, possibly even a child, too young really to take control of the country, and that therefore his mother, Ahmose Nefertari, reigned as a kind of regent. That might explain her prominence in his reign. In any case, one of the ways in which the reign of Amenhotep I appears to have been peculiarly important is that he, along with his mother, Ahmose Nefertari, was the founder of the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina. Deir el-Medina, of course, is the place where the workmen who cut and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings and elsewhere in the Theban necropolis lived. And the settlement was set up there in order that these craftsmen could be close to their place of work. So it's entirely dedicated, first and foremost, to the project of creating new royal tombs in the new Valley of the Kings cemetery. And as the celebrated founder of this settlement, or founders of this settlement, Amenhotep I and Ahmose Nefertari occupy a very prominent place in the minds and the beliefs of the Deir el-Medina villagers, not just during their lifetimes, but for many centuries after this time as well. So for this reason, that as late as the 20th dynasty, we are still seeing images of Amenhotep I cropping up alongside the regular gods in the decoration in Deir el-Medina tombs. So this is quite a good example. This is the tomb of Nakht Amen TT 335 at Deir el-Medina. Those of you who've been to the tombs at the site will know that they're quite small in size relative to certainly to the royal tombs and to the higher status elite tombs in the Theban cemetery. They're very, very richly and beautifully decorated, and often the decoration is rather less formulaic than it is certainly in the royal tombs, and to some extent less formulaic than in the other elite tombs too. It's as though the artist had a bit more freedom to show what they wanted to on their tomb walls. And it seems that one of the things that they wanted to show was a deified Amenhotep I, who we see here, his name written in a cartouche here, Jesa Kara, being attended to by the goddesses Wajit and Nate. So he's absolutely the equal of these. And all pharaohs, of course, were divine, semi-divine at least to some extent during their lifetimes. They were the earthly manifestation of the god Horus, and in death they became at one with Osiris. So they do have divine status, but nonetheless, Amenhotep I seems to have been elevated above all of the other kings of this period. We don't see any other New Kingdom pharaohs cropping up in tomb decoration like this. So he's a very important individual to the Deir el-Medina workmen. And we know from other instances of particularly celebrated individuals from other times in Egyptian history that their tombs often come to be very important places for the people worshipping them. I'm thinking in particular of somebody like Imhotep, whose tomb seems to have been a focus for cult activity centuries after he died. So we might expect, given the prominent position of Amenhotep I in the minds and the lives and the tomb decoration of the villagers of Deir el-Medina at least, that his tomb also would occupy a similarly important place, and yet it is missing. Those are the list of 18th Dynasty kings, and by the way, just in case that's helpful. So Amenhotep I coming in second here, according to this list. Anyway, he reigned from 1514 down to 1493, just over 20-year reign. The question of when the Valley of the Kings came into use actually is very relevant to our story today, and we'll be exploring this a bit more as we go along. It's also one of the use of the Valley of the Kings is one of the defining features of the New Kingdom. It has a clear starting point, the defeat of the Hyksos and reunification of the country, and it has a clear end point as well, the death of Ramesses the 11th, the last king of the 20th dynasty, which signals a split in the country. In fact, it happened a little bit earlier in the reign of Ramesses the 11th, but the country split between north and south again. So the period of unification ended at this point, bringing in the next period, third intermediate period, beginning with the 21st dynasty. But the Valley of the Kings is in use almost exactly for that same period. Ramesses the 11th himself had a tomb cut in the Valley of the Kings, cut and decorated. It seems he never used it, but certainly in the earlier part of his reign, it was intended that he would be buried there. But after that point, no more new royal tombs were ever cut in the valley again. So the end of the New Kingdom is also partly defined by the end of the use of the Valley of the Kings. And its use was coming to an end, arguably, earlier than this. It was probably partly chosen as the location for the royal cemetery because the authorities hoped that it would provide them with more of a chance of keeping the tombs secure. But we know that during the later 20th dynasty in particular, but in fact as early as the reign of Ramesses III, that tombs were being robbed, and that this was a growing problem. And we have evidence of instances of robbery, particularly from the time of Ramesses IX and Ramesses XI. And we also know, thanks to various different classes of evidence, that this ultimately led to the authorities taking the decision to remove the mummies from all of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, to, where necessary, put them into new mummy bandages and new coffins, and then to bury those coffins in two groups, in two secret caches, one of them in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV number 35, the tomb of Amenhotep II, which is it that one? I'm not quite sure I remember rightly. I think it's probably that one. Anyway, doesn't matter. In one of those caches in the Valley of the Kings, the other one nearby, but just over the other side of the cliffs, in Deir al-Bahari, or just sort of around the corner, as we'll see from the Hatshepsut temple, in Theban tomb 320. This is relevant to us because it in fact yielded, these caches when they were discovered, yielded among others the coffined mummy of Amenhotep I, as we will see. So these caches are relevant to our story from that point of view. Now, along with the caches themselves, which give us the kind of evidence of what happened in the end, at the end of this process of robbery, and the authorities taking decisions as to what to do, we know that the caches came about and we found the caches. But we also have, fantastically, a collection of papyrus documents which provide much more detail about the processes leading up to this. And these collectively are known now as the tomb robbery papyri, and they describe instances in which tombs were found to have been robbed, the capture of the culprits, criminal proceedings, a trial, and eventually conviction and punishment. And the robbers were sentenced to rather violent deaths, showing very clearly, if it weren't obvious already, that robbing tombs was not something the authorities were very keen on. In addition to this, though, they also give us some information about tomb inspections, which were being carried out on a regular basis, perhaps more regularly as this became a more pressing problem. And in one instance, the inspections give us a bit of detail about the tombs concerned, and possibly their location, which is relevant to our story because it includes a description of the location of the tomb of Amenhotep I. And the papyrus in question is this one. It's called the Abbott Papyrus, after a Dr. Abbott, who sold it to the British Museum in about 1851, I think. So he had presumably bought it on the open market. So we don't exactly know where it came from. Probably it was originally deposited in a temple archive, probably on the West Bank in Thebes somewhere. Some of the other papyri were found, for example, at Medinet Habu actually in one case in a pottery jar, all stored together. So it probably came from a deposit like that. We're not really clear. In any case, the text itself is incredibly valuable to us. It doesn't look like much, this, but it's a very, very important document worth going to see next time you're at the British Museum, as and when we ever get the chance to go and do that again. It's in the funerary galleries on the first floor, the Roxy Walker galleries of Egyptian funerary archaeology. It gives us a list of tombs that were inspected by the authorities, which we can break into 3 groups as here. The earliest of the kings represented, or whose tombs are represented in this list, are Amenhotep II of the 11th dynasty, and the slightly later king Nebhepet Amenhotep II. These are the only 2 tombs in the list that we are able certainly to identify on the ground. Amenhotep was buried in a tomb called the Saf el-Kisasiyah, and Nebhepet Amenhotep at Deir el-Bahri. Saf tombs, by the way, Saf as in Saf el-Kisasiyah. Saf is an Arabic word meaning row, and it's used by Egyptologists and archaeologists to describe the kinds of tombs that you see in Theban hills, like this is the Sheikh Abdel Gurna hill, running sort of like this. You can walk around the back of it. Lovely walk if you want to do that around the back. And these what appear to be sort of rows of doorways or entranceways in the rock here. There's another one here. There's another one here. These are these Saf tombs. They are rock cut, and the architects were cutting into the rock but leaving rows of square-based pillars. So to create this sort of a row of pillars, and then beyond this row there is a rectangular shape, and then a doorway which goes into the rock, into the further chambers beyond. Some of you may have visited some of these this type of tomb. Anyway, they're called Saf tombs locally. So the Saf el-Kisasiyah is one such tomb. It's to be found a little way to the north of the greater part of the Theban cemeteries, in what's now known as it says Antef here, Antef or Intef cemetery, because it's where a number of tombs and other monuments of the time of the Intef kings. There are kings named Intef in the 11th and 17th dynasties. The ones that we're looking at here are 11th dynasty kings labeled, so Mentuhotep, Sankh-Ibtawi. The Saf el-Kisasiyah is one of those that's here. Just for orientation purposes, incidentally, if you're traveling through the necropolis, this is the road here. The entrance to Hatshepsut's temple, etc., is a little way to the south. Sheikh Abdel Gurna and the tombs of the nobles are to the south, off to the left of this map. The road runs along the bottom of the Dra Abu el-Naga, Dra Abu el-Naga hills here. And then if you carry on, if you're going to the Valley of the Kings, you do a left at this point, and the road starts to climb up into the mountains, and the valley itself is beyond up here. You may have visited Howard Carter's house, which is now open as a museum just in this area. So to get to the Intef cemetery, you need to go sort of eastwards, and then I think I'm right in saying that there's a Muslim cemetery in this area here, which you might be familiar with, and the Intef cemetery is just a little way beyond this road here. The tomb of Mentuhotep II, Nebhepet Ra, is at Deir el-Bahri, as I mentioned. So Deir el-Bahri we normally associate with the Temple of Hatshepsut, which is what dominates the landscape and dominates this photograph. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with it. It's this temple here. Very striking and very unusual in its architecture, and really rather wonderful in its sort of marriage of built man-made monument and natural landscape set into this incredible sweep of the cliffs. And it's composed of 3 platforms, 1, 2, and 3, connected by these ramps. And the Hatshepsut and her architects, in fact, were inspired in this. They weren't the originators of this idea, but inspired by Amenhotep's temple, which, although it's much less visible, is present just a little way to the south. Here, the Hatshepsut temple is what you see now is partly temple that remains standing from ancient times, partly ancient material that's been restored, and partly new material that's been added to that to give you an idea of what the temple would have looked like. That process has been going on particularly since the 1960s. The Amenhotep temple has never been subject to the same level of restoration, which is why it's almost invisible. The best way to get a look at it is to try and see it from above. So if you are able to clamber up into the hills and the cliffs behind, you can get a view like this. It's not really possible, unfortunately, to do that anymore. The security services prevent people from doing the walk behind the temple. So I feel lucky to have been able to get this photograph a few years ago in 2015. So this is the temple of Hatshepsut is off to the left here. This is the edge of it, the edge of the first platform. This is the main platform in the Amenhotep temple, a squared area here with a massive kind of rubble mound in the center, and then 3 rows of columns surrounding this platform, then a leveled platform behind, and which then cuts into the natural hillside with further columns. And this was discovered. There were traces of it that were revealed during excavations in the middle of the 19th century, but nobody really understood what was there until Edouard Naville's excavations of the Hatshepsut temple at Deir el-Bahri, excavations on behalf of the Egypt Exploration Fund, extended southwards. Naville noticed that there was a continuation of something south of the Hatshepsut temple, so he followed this and eventually came across a retaining wall made of much larger blocks than the Hatshepsut temple, blocks that were of a size that was characteristic of the Middle Kingdom. So he decided to investigate and revealed this entire temple, revealing that in fact Hatshepsut wasn't the great genius behind this architectural form, but she was really just following her 11th dynasty predecessors. This is the rubble mound here, and you can see some of these pillars emerging from the ground here already. This is Naville's plan. So this is oriented 180 degrees around from the photograph I showed you just earlier, which was taken from this direction, looking down. So we can see what Naville calls a pyramid base here in the center of this platform, surrounded by a number of colonnades. And as you can see, it's built right up against the natural line of the cliffs and then cut into them right at the very back. This is the edge of the Hatshepsut temple here. So what Naville saw as he began excavating in this area was a retaining wall here along the line of the cliffs, which then continues around here along the edge of the platform. So he just continued his work in this direction, revealing this incredible temple. This is how Naville reconstructed it. So he believed that the rubble mound was what remained of what was originally a pyramid. I found out the other day, I was informed the other day by Sarah Griffiths of Ancient Egypt magazine, that in the 1970s, Dieter Arnold, the German architect, suggested that on the basis of the size of the blocks in the mound as preserved, there's no way that they could have supported a full pyramid, in which case this was just some kind of a mound. And mounds of this kind have symbolic importance in Egyptian mythology. They evoke the idea of the higher lying mounds in the Delta region, which we call Gezira, which sat above the water table, and those were the parts of the land on which things grew. So mounds like this were considered to be very fertile, or to evoke the idea of, you know, life-giving force, and so it wouldn't be inappropriate at all if it wasn't a pyramid, but just some kind of a mound in the center here. A funerary monument like this, of course, magically wanting to evoke the idea not of death but of rebirth, and, you know, life springing forth again. But in any case, pyramid or not, in the rest of the reconstruction, this is more or less what the temple would have looked like. So there's a kind of northern court here, composed of a retaining wall banked up against the natural cliffside, and then the terrace here in a wall connecting Mentuhotep and Hatshepsut. And then you've got these colonnaded areas here. At the walls behind these colonnades are very, very beautifully decorated with extremely fine reliefs, unfortunately just found in smashed fragments everywhere, but lots of them made their way into various collections, not just in Egypt but around the world. The British Museum has nice examples. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has a very fine example showing an image of the king. So it was a very, very fine monument. And at the back you have this terrace cut into the cliffs with an opening in the back here, which leads to a vaulted passageway, at the end of which was a chamber. Now, Naville didn't find enough in the chamber to persuade him that this was actually a tomb, but in all other respects, it looks very much like that was what it was intended for: a descending passageway leading down into the mountain, into the rock, reaching down to the underground where Lord of the Underworld is thought to dwell, a chamber at the bottom behind a temple, which is clearly a sort of mortuary style temple, dedicated to the memory of Mentuhotep II. It looks very much like this was a tomb, even though, as with the Ahmose complex at Abydos, the clinching evidence wasn't found. We don't have any better candidates, and this looks very much like a tomb. So the consensus view is that this is the tomb of Mentuhotep II. Naville found lots of other things here, some of which is relevant to the story of Amenhotep I. He found a number of statues of the later Middle Kingdom, including some like this one, a rather sort of a miserable looking 12th dynasty pharaoh. 6 of these actually made their way to the British Museum. 3 of them are on display in the sculpture gallery. So these come from the E.F. Naville excavations at Deir el-Bahari. So the temple was not just a temple of Mentuhotep II, it was still in use, certainly towards the end of the 12th dynasty. And the discovery of this statue shows that it was still very much a viable temple and very much in use and alive in the time of Amenhotep I as well. This is a statue of the king, again looking a little bit glum. Sandstone, he's shown wearing the double crown here, the red coloration of the red crown in particular shows up quite nicely here. And he's in the Osirid pose, which is interesting. This puts Amenhotep I in the position of Osiris, and it evokes the idea of Amenhotep I in the form of a deceased individual. So not only is Amenhotep present here, but it seems that he's present in the form of a dead king. So perhaps this temple somehow is connected with his funerary cult. So just hold that in mind. This is possibly very important for us, as you can imagine. So we know of those 2 tombs, the tombs of Wah-Ankh-Imhotep II in the Intef cemetery to the north, the northern end of the Theban necropolis, and the temple of Mentuhotep Ra II. Of the other kings, Sobekemsaf I of the 17th dynasty, his tomb was found to be plundered at the time of the inspection. We don't exactly know where it was, but it was already violated by year 16 Ramesses the 11th. We don't know the whereabouts of these 2 kings named Intef. And of course, by the way, the text itself doesn't give us these numbers, 5th and 6th, and scholars of the Second Intermediate Period are still arguing about exactly which of the Intef kings should be the 5th and 6th in the sequence. But in any case, it seems that these 2 Intefs were probably 2 of 3, all of whom are represented by burial equipment that's been discovered by archaeologists in the last couple of centuries. So they are two of three of Nubkhepera Intef, whose coffin, BMEA 6652, is now in the collections of the British Museum. It's actually only a few meters away from the Abbott Papyrus, so that's another thing you could go and see if you get a chance next time you're there. Sekimra Heru Hiamat Intef, whose coffin is the middle one of the three here, in the Louvre in Paris, E3020, and Sekimre Wetmart Intef, whose coffin is also in the Louvre in the same case as you can see here. These were discovered during the excavations of Mariette, I think, in the middle of the 19th century in Dra Abu al-Naga. All this material seems to have come from that place. So it seems that the Dra Abu al-Naga hills are the area of the 17th Dynasty royal necropolis. We can't be sure exactly where the tombs are, but they are somewhere in there. And in fact, the tomb of Nubkhepera Intef, undoubtedly the tomb of Nubkhepera Intef, the individual whose coffin is in the British Museum, the one on the left here, was identified by a German mission in the 1990s. So we can't be sure that it's Nubkhepera Intef whose tomb was visited by the inspection team, but his tomb certainly now is known to be in the Dra Abu al-Naga hills, topped with a little pyramid of mud brick. So we know a bit about the Intefs, even if we don't exactly know where the tombs are. Kamose is also represented by a mummy and a coffin discovered again at Dra Abu al-Naga, again suggesting that this is the Theban necropolis of the royal 17th Dynasty line. The coffin is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Not a great photo of it, I'm afraid, but it's about the best I could find from an article from 1908 in Annales du Service. The mummy was found with the coffin, but the coffin wasn't initially recognized as being that of the king of Kamose, and the mummy is now lost. It's not entirely clear how this came about, but quite possibly it's to do with the fact that the significance of the coffin wasn't initially realized, and by the time it was identified as being the king who defeated the Hyksos, great King Kamose, the mummy had gone. So we did have it, or we don't anymore. In any case, it came from Dra Abu al-Naga, confirming the importance of that part of the world. Finally, as I mentioned just earlier, although we don't have the tomb, we do actually have the body and the coffin of Amenhotep I. So in this case, even if we do find the tomb, we are not to expect it to be intact, because it was one of the tombs that was subject to this recaching process. The body was found in the so-called royal cache tomb. There are two royal caches, as I mentioned, one in the Valley of the Kings. The other one is this one, Theban tomb 320, sometimes referred to as Deir al-Bahari 320, and most commonly referred to as the royal cache. And it's accessed, some of you might have visited, via a steep slope, apparently heading not really anywhere in particular, but in the direction of the cliffs. Hatshepsut Temple is a little way off to our right, as we look at this image. And you can see it's a fairly steep slope, which brings you out onto this horizontal trackway leading again towards the cliffs, which ultimately brings you to a fairly unassuming looking opening in the rock, but clearly a man-made cutting in the rock. This is the shaft, which is at the top of the tomb, the shaft leading down to a series of corridors and chambers, in which the mummies and coffins of around 50 individuals altogether, including a number of New Kingdom and earlier pharaohs, were found. This is the coffin and mummy of Amenhotep I. The last time I looked anyway was in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It will, I think, as all the royal mummies are going, it will eventually be transferred to the new National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, which is in Cairo, a little way to the east of the present day Tahrir Museum in the direction of the Mokattam Hills. So it's probably going to move there soon if it hasn't already. As you can see, this is another very old photograph, I'm afraid, from Grafton Elliott Smith's volume on the royal mummies, the mummy found inside this coffin. It's not clear whether this was the coffin that Amenhotep was originally buried in, but it bears his name, and that allows us to identify the mummy. We don't have much documentation at all about the discovery of the royal cache tomb, sadly. You may know the story. It was originally discovered not by archaeologists, but by a family of locals, the Abder Rasul family, in particular by two brothers in the family, and realizing that they had discovered something, rather a rich deposit of material, including not only the mummies and their coffins, but a little bit of burial equipment as well. Most of the burial equipment had been stripped away, but a little bit remained, including some very fine papyri and jewelry like this one. These, of course, are very saleable items. The Abder Rasul brothers realized this and decided that they wanted to begin selling items for a profit, but not in such a way as to catch the attention of the authorities. They wanted to sell things in dribs and drabs, so as to avoid alerting the authorities to this sensational discovery. And so for a number of, perhaps as many as a number of years, perhaps as much as a number of years, the discovery remained unknown to the archaeological world. But eventually, at the beginning of the 1880s, the museum authorities began to realize that a rather suspicious quantity of material, particularly of the 21st dynasty, had begun to appear on the market, particularly papyri. So they dispatched two curators, Emil Brugsch and Ahmed Kemal Pasha, Brugsch German, Ahmed Kemal Egyptian, to Luxor to investigate. And with the help of some local government officials, they were eventually led to the Abder Rasul brothers, who, under some duress, I'm not going to say torture, but well, I'll leave it to your imagination, they eventually confessed and led the archaeologists to Theban tomb number 320. The curators were expecting to find an intact 21st dynasty tomb, because most of the material that they knew had come from this discovery was of that date. So they entered the tomb and were completely and utterly blown away by the sight of these 50-ish coffins and mummies, including, as they quickly realized from the inscriptions on the coffins, a number of New Kingdom pharaohs, some of the most important individuals ever to have lived in Egypt. And here were their very bodies in front of them. And this was before the discovery of the cache in KV35, so there was no awareness at this point that there were such things as these royal caches. Although the Abder Rasuls had been forced under pressure from the authorities to confess, the archaeologists were still very worried that their discovery of the material would be very, very unpopular with not just the Abder Rasul family, but the locals in general, who had been, after all, benefiting from the sale of these things. They knew that all of these things were now going to be seized by the authorities. So the archaeologists were very worried for the safety of the material. For that reason, the tomb was emptied more or less overnight as soon as they got there. And as a result of that, almost no documentation of the archaeological situation survives, and there's very, very little documentation of the process of its removal as well. So we have the material, we have the coffins and the mummies and various other bits and pieces. That's great, but it would be very, very helpful to know a little bit more about the situation down there. It's certain that we would be able to learn something about the process of the deposit. We know that the caching process didn't happen in a single instance. It happened over the course of decades, and things were moved not just once, but on several occasions. The last activity we know of dates to the early 22nd dynasty, a very long time after the end of the New Kingdom. So it would have been very helpful to know all this, but we don't have anything. And so for that reason, I like to show stills from a favourite film of mine, The Night of Counting the Years, an Egyptian movie of 1961. You might know it. This is an actor playing the part of one of the Abder Rasul brothers, holding up to the light of somebody's flaming torch a very handsome pectoral with a wedge art eye on it, the kind that we know to have belonged to Ramses II, Tutankhamun, and no doubt lots of other kings as well. Here are some of the actors examining the coffins. In this scene, they're sort of ticking off the names of the New Kingdom pharaohs as they find them in the tomb. And then eventually the material is lifted out in a hurry from the tomb. There was a project to re-examine the tomb led by Erhard Greifer in the early 2000s, I think late 1990s, early 2000s, which discovered some fragments of painted plaster and wood at the bottom of the shaft here, which Greifer suggests is probably the result of the coffins having been drawn out of the shaft like this, kind of swinging and bashing on the sides, and so chunks of the coffins coming away and falling down to the bottom of the shaft, where they stayed until he was able to recover them again. And then eventually these things are led out across the Theban necropolis, and the film was shot on location. This sequence was filmed in places like Medina Habu, which you see here, the Colossi Memnon, before eventually making its way to the boat. It seems a bit of an unlikely route to me for them to have taken if they were going directly to the river from TT320. But anyway, it makes for some very picturesque scenes in the sort of, not quite the dead of night, but early morning before the sun's really properly risen. It's a cracking film. It's not quite an entirely factual account of what's going on, but it gives you a sense of what was happening, and also a sense of the competing parties of the locals who've made this discovery. After all, it was they who found it, and the big shots from Cairo who get to come down and just take everything away from them. It's quite an important reminder that there's more going on in situations like this than just archaeological issues. So great film, and by the way, it's freely accessible online, and it was restored by Martin Scorsese's foundation a few years ago, so there's a nice clean copy that you can see with subtitles now online, and I recommend you seek it out. At some point, I'd quite like to do a more of a talk about the royal caches. I may do that at some point in the future if that's of interest, but for now the movie does a great job of telling the story. Anyway, that was something of a digression. I hope you'll forgive me. The Abbott Papyrus gives us this incredible description of the location of the tomb. The tomb of Amenhotep I gets more attention in Papyrus Abbott than any of the others. The text tells us that the eternal horizon of King Djeser-Kare, the son of Ra, Amenhotep, which measures 120 cubits in depth from its stela called Pa'akar, north of the house of Amenhotep the garden. So this is what we know of the location. It's clearly the tomb of Amenhotep I. The middle section, which is a bit garbled in the translation here, seems to suggest that the tomb is to be found 120 cubits in depth, in other words, 120 cubits beneath its stela called Pa'akar. We don't exactly know what that means, but it is understood to mean some sort of high place. So the tomb is to be found 120 cubits beneath a high place, some sort of significant high place. We don't know what that is. And it's also north of the house of Amenhotep the garden. House in this sense is the Egyptian word per, which does have the meaning of house, as in the kind of house that that I live in, and you will too, no doubt. It also has the meaning of something like temple. So a house of Amenhotep in this case wouldn't be his dwelling place; it would be a temple. So it's some sort of cult monument of Amenhotep, presumably the same Amenhotep I, of the garden. So we don't quite know which monument of Amenhotep's this might be, but it's something associated with a garden somehow or other. So let's have a look at some of these candidates. The first of these tombs is in the Valley of Kings, and it is given the number Kings Valley 39. This was discovered in the late 19th century by two individuals called Macarius and Andraus, about whom very little is known, certainly to me. If you have any information, do let me know. They were given permission by the Antiquities Service to dig in the Theban necropolis, but they weren't archaeologists. They were interested in finding things that they could sell. Nonetheless, the Antiquities Service seems to have been happy to give them permission, and they made the discovery of this tomb, which was given a KV number. Whether or not it was right for it to be given a KV number or not is not clear. We'll look at why that might be in a moment. It was not too long afterwards cleared by somebody with much more robust archaeological credentials, a man called Arthur Weigall, who was an English archaeologist. He trained with Flinders Petrie, and by this point he had succeeded Howard Carter as Chief Inspector of Antiquities in Upper Egypt. So he was well trained, very knowledgeable, highly skilled, and in a very responsible position. And not very long after this, Weigall published a guidebook to the antiquities of Upper Egypt, in which he claimed that KV 39 was the tomb of Amenhotep I. He doesn't give a great deal of evidence for this, but there it is stated in his book. It's the tomb of Amenhotep I. The tomb itself, KV 39, is somewhere in this area here, I think, or possibly slightly further along. I should have dropped a pin into this map, I'm sorry. In any case, the important sort of point here is that the greater part of the Valley of the Kings is in this area here, around where the pin is. So as you can see, the road, excuse me, leading to the Valley of the Kings from the cultivation snakes around, winds up into the hills in this direction, and you actually approach the valleys sort of from the north in a southwards facing direction. And the beginning of the valley is the valley proper, where the tombs are, at least, is roughly here. And you then head up the valley, and this is in fact the central part where the rest house is, and the tomb of Tutankhamun is in the middle here. And the tombs mostly are clustered in this area. The one exception to that is the so-called Western Valley, which runs off in this direction, and it's at the end of this trackway here that you'll find the tombs of Amenhotep III, tomb of I, one or two other unfinished tombs, etc. So there's the western branch and then the main branch. But the tomb of, or the supposed tomb of Amenhotep I, according to Weigall, KV 39, is a little way away, along or just a little bit below the line of the cliffs behind Deir el-Bahari and Sheikh Abdul Ghana in this area. So the tomb is, I'm not absolutely sure where it is on this map, roughly in this area, I think. So a little bit apart. It's in the area of these somewhat enigmatic structures. They are preserved as low walls built of roughly cut stone blocks. They're often thought of as workmen's huts. So this spot is on the pathway that runs from Deir el-Medina to this point, and at this point you have the choice of either heading sort of left of frame here and dropping down into the Valley of the Kings, or continuing sort of forwards and then ultimately to the right and dropping down into Deir el-Bahari to visit the Temple of Hatshepsut. So these buildings here are on the route that the villagers of Deir el-Medina probably would have taken on their way to work in the Valley of the Kings. So for this reason, they're associated with the workmen. There might be huts of some kind. It's also been suggested that they might be an outpost for guards. One of the reasons the Valley of the Kings was probably chosen as the location for the royal cemetery from the 18th dynasty onwards was that it was thought that it would be easier to secure the tombs against robbers if they were in a far distant place, separated from the mortuary temples where people would have had a good reason to be, to maintain the cult of the deceased kings. No good reason really for anybody to be visiting the tombs at this point. So put them far distant. Anybody found wandering around in this area without a good reason to be there would have some explaining to do. So perhaps this is a guards, a kind of sentry post. It's not really very clear. In any case, they are close to KV39. So these are those huts up here. This is the line of the edge of the cliffs up here. And KV39 is here. So as you can see, it is some way away from the main part of the Valley of the Kings. And there's a clear sort of pattern to where all these tombs are built. And this one is not really in the valley, but it was given a King's Valley number. So to that extent, it is a Valley of the King's tomb. I have to thank here Richard Selix, Dick Selix, some of you may know. He's been to Egypt on many occasions and often been to out-of-the-way places, taking really terrific photos, including to places that I've not actually been myself. So he's very kindly supplied me with a few photographs for this talk. So a big thank you to Dick. This is one such photograph showing the location of KV39 here. As Dick's photograph shows, directly beneath watercourses which empty into the tomb, oddly enough. And this is the entrance to the tomb. This is actually a photograph that Dick provided me, which appears in Lost Tomb, so I owe him that too. Again, unassuming looking entranceway, very, very rarely visited, so there's no reason for anybody to sort of tidy this up. And this is what it looks like on the inside. It's entered from here. So Dick's photograph is taken looking downwards here towards the entranceway. There's then a descending staircase which takes you into a sort of antechamber, or it's labelled vestibule here. And from here, the vestibule provides access to two corridors. So it's a kind of twin axis tomb. One running down a staircase and then via a series of descending passages with steps at various intervals, eventually terminating in a burial chamber with a kind of recess, which looks very much like the emplacement for a sarcophagus, something like that. So it appears very much to be a kind of burial chamber. Then there's a second axis leading downwards from roughly the same point in the vestibule. Again, descending passageway, staircase, doorways at regular intervals, finally terminating in a chamber which is labelled here burial chamber. So it seems to be a kind of it's an unusual monument. It seems to be a kind of twin monument. So how do we explain this? In the I think mostly 1990s and into the 2000s, the team was reinvestigated by an English archaeologist called John Rose, assisted by various others, including particularly a man called Ian Buckley. And they were of the view that this was indeed the tomb of Amenhotep I. And on the question of whether or not it was really a Valley of the King's tomb, they argue that in fact it is, but its unusual location, slightly aside from all the others, is explained by the fact that it's at what they call the head of the Valley of the Kings, as if it's the first in a sort of sequence of tombs that are then going to be built in this direction towards where all the other tombs are, as if it's almost sort of pointing the way to this new cemetery. So they're arguing that the Valley of the Kings was in fact begun by Amenhotep I. This was the first tomb in the sequence. They found in the tomb dockets naming Thutmose I, Thutmose II, and Amenhotep II. Dockets are these little pieces of typically wood or mummy wrapping, ceramic, that kind of thing, inscribed with very, very short text in ink in hieratic. So the sort of cursive handwritten form of the Egyptian script. Giving very basic label type information, explaining what the things that they're associated with are. So we find them often in the royal caches, and they record information such as the identity of the person in a coffin, and then what had happened. So they might say things like, this is the mummy of such and such a person. It was rewrapped on this particular date, and it was given a new coffin, and it was placed in this place. Okay, so very much sort of administrative records, if you like. And these dockets were found in KV39 relating to these three kings. So no record, you'll notice, of Amenhotep I at all, but they probably don't relate to the original burials of these kings. It's more likely that these are part of the caching process, and that therefore KV39 was one of the places to which mummies were moved as part of that process. Even if they ultimately ended up somewhere else, it seems they were temporarily placed in KV 39, but it doesn't help us to understand the tomb as that of Amenhotep I in any way. The double nature of the tomb might be significant. It calls to mind the idea, one possible explanation for this is that it is the tomb of two individuals of equal or near equal status. If it's a royal tomb, we would be looking for a king or somebody else of very high status and somebody else connected with them of very similar near equal status. And that calls to mind the curious situation at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, in which we have Ahmose I very much associated with his grandmother Teti Sheri, and then also Amenhotep I very much associated with his mother Ahmose Nefertari. And this was probably in Weigel's mind when he made the suggestion that this is the tomb of Amenhotep I and his wife. He must have been thinking Ahmose Nefertari. In addition to this, the way station, those workmen's huts, are approximately 120 cubits on higher ground above the entrance to the tomb of Amenhotep I, or sorry, the tomb of KV 39. So in that regard, KV 39 can be made to fit the description in Papyrus Abbott. Now, I'm sure you're all thinking that this is hardly clinching evidence, but in this regard, it's not completely wrong. So if you want to believe KV 39 is the tomb of Amenhotep I, you might have that in mind. Let's look at some other candidates. The next one, which came to the attention of archaeologists only a few years after KV 39, is tomb ANB. And this wasn't exactly discovered by Carter, but he was the first archaeologist to visit it and to interpret what it might be. This tomb is at Tra Abu al-Naga, which you will remember is the site of numerous burials of 17th dynasty kings. It seems to be the cemetery of the 17th dynasty kings. And let's not forget that Amenhotep I is part of that line, even though he is an 18th dynasty king. It's the same family. Carter was not only an archaeologist, but he was on the side a kind of dealer in antiquities as well. And this wasn't that uncommon in his day. He was dealing on behalf of people like his patron, the Earl of Carnarvon, also the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and various other institutions. It was also, of course, of use and interest to him as an archaeologist to know what was coming onto the market, because things that were coming onto the market had most probably recently been discovered by locals in the area, just as the discovery of TT320, the Royal Cash Tomb, had been made by the Abder Rasool brothers. One day, Carter was brought some fragments of this restored in this photograph alabaster vessel, bearing a short inscription giving us the name of the Hemtnesu, the wife of the king, Ahmose Nefertari. That's the cartouche at the top left-hand corner here. So it's unambiguously a jar belonging to Ahmose Nefertari. And Carter had already, at this point, this is around about 1914, if I remember rightly, he had already got it in mind that the search for, and he hoped the discovery of Amenhotep I would be a suitably sensational project for him to pursue. Already by this point, he was very keen on making a high-profile discovery. So this was of great interest to him, and he asked to be taken to the place where these fragments were found. And he was led to this part of the world, a very desolate-looking place. We are, I think, probably looking from approximately the location of the road winding up to the Valley of the Kings, roughly southwards, to a point in the hills behind Tra Abu al-Naga. And his own annotation here on the photograph shows us, and this is where it says Tomb of Amenhotep I, and he's pointing to this spot here. So this is where it is. We're far away from the beaten track here. It does make you wonder how on earth anybody could ever come across little fragments of alabaster from the time of Ahmose Nefertari, but somebody did, and they were able to lead Carter to this place. Again, I have to thank Dick Sellex for this photograph. He's been to the spot. I haven't. This is there's now a pathway, as you can see, leading up to the entrance. It really doesn't look like much. If you were in this area, you certainly wouldn't be thinking to yourself, "Wow, here's a royal tomb." This is the opening. This is all you can see from the surface. So again, very unassuming looking entranceway, but it leads into quite a substantial monument. And Carter will not in any way have been put off thinking that this was something very special by the architecture. So this is the entrance shaft here. It leads to a roughly sort of horizontal passageway, which then leads to a well, a deep well of the kind that features large in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, becomes absolutely a feature of New Kingdom royal tomb design in the period following this, following the time of Amenhotep I. That on the other side leads to a continuation of the corridor, which terminates in a burial chamber with 2 pillars. So this is a substantial tomb terminating in a substantial burial chamber, architecturally interesting with these pillars left in the center, and the well, as I mentioned, very much makes this look like the New Kingdom royal tomb type we know of from the Valley of the Kings. And fragmentary vessels of not only Ahmose Nefertari but also Amenhotep I himself were discovered in this area. It seems from the architecture that this is clearly an 18th dynasty tomb type, and it's also in Dra Abu el-Naga in approximately the area of the 17th dynasty tombs. So all of this together makes this look very much as though it is a strong candidate to be the tomb. No more evidence than this has been found, so it's still not enough to persuade everybody. Probably not enough to clinch the case, but it's a strong case nonetheless. There is, though, another candidate also in the Dra Abu el-Naga area, and this was known of for many years. It was given the number Theban Tomb 293, but has subsequently, since it's come to be re-investigated in the 1990s and onwards by a German mission, has been given a new designation, K9311/12. This was excavated by Daniel Polz of the German Archaeological Institute, as I mentioned, from the 1990s onwards. It was previously known to have been the tomb of the chief priest of Amen-Ramesses Nacht of the time of Ramesses IV of the 20th dynasty. So that's a long time after the time of Amenhotep I, of course. But it's in the area of the 17th dynasty royal burials, right in the thick of it. And you may remember I already mentioned that the tomb of Nubkepera-Intef of the 17th dynasty was identified in the 1990s. That was by the same archaeologist and the same project in this area. So K931112 is very much part of this area that we know for sure, thanks to Daniel Polz's work, was in use as a 17th dynasty royal burial place. The ceramics in K931112 are not of the time of Ramesses IV, the time of Ramesses Nacht, but from the early 18th dynasty onwards. And so it seems as though Ramesses Nacht, although we're clear that he was buried there, was reusing an earlier monument. It seems indeed to have been a very substantial tomb of the late 17th or early 18th dynasty. And there are a number of other features which are very interesting about it. It has a very grand courtyard in front of it, comprising a portico and a pylon. And the restored mud brick wall here gives you an idea of the sort of shape of the courtyard in front of the tomb proper, which is cut into the hillside here. And this is the pylon at the front. So tombs typically aren't marked by grand entrances such as this, certainly not with pylons. That would be unusual for this type of tomb. It's also, this is perhaps the most intriguing part of it, it seems to have been a kind of a double tomb. It has two entrances and a kind of double forecourt separated by a mud brick wall, and it seems to have been designed as a double tomb from the beginning. So it's not as though this was a monument for a single individual that was then extended to incorporate a second burial. It was conceived from the outset as a double tomb designed for a high status pair. So again, this calls to mind the idea of Amenhotep I and his having been buried perhaps alongside his mother, Ahmose-Nefertari, who is so important during his reign. This is another of Dick's photographs showing the courtyard area and then the cliffs at the back and the entrance into the cliffs here. So you or one of the entrances anyway, so you get an idea of the approximate sort of shape of the tomb. So Ahmose-Nefertari is significant for this reason. We should perhaps be looking for a kind of a double tomb, and perhaps KV39 and K9311 fit that bill. Another thing which is very interesting about K931112 is that it appears to have been located directly north of a temple of Amenhotep I. The courtyard, this is K931112 up here in the red circle. The courtyard seems to have two entrances. One directly faces the rock-cut entrance to the tomb proper here along, so it's facing the tomb in this sort of direction. But there is a second point of access to the courtyard on this side here, which leads off in a roughly sort of southerly direction. It's not really south, sorry, it's more like a sort of westerly direction, following the line of a natural watercourse in the rock, which has been deliberately sculpted in ancient times into a kind of descending pathway. So this clearly was a point of access leading up to the courtyard, or leading from the courtyard. This pathway then takes almost a right angle turn to the left in this direction, again down the hillside, following the natural course, a natural water course, which has been deliberately kind of manipulated so as to create a pathway. And at this point, if you follow the line of that path all the way down to here, you eventually hit absolutely the temple of Amenhotep I, which has the name Men-Iset. And this, in fact, was excavated by Carter. It's very little known. Very little of it survives. I don't know if there's anything visible on the ground. I've not, I admit, I've not tried to look, but that is the location. We're clear about that. So K9311 seems to be directly connected to it. And although access to it would be via this path with a right angle turn in it, if you draw a line running more or less absolutely north-south as the crow flies, from the Men-Iset to K9311, you would be going in almost exactly a north-south direction. And this, of course, recalls to mind the idea from Papyrus Abbott that the tomb of Amenhotep is north of the temple, the house of Amenhotep of the garden. There's no garden aspect to this that we know of, but it is certainly a temple of Amenhotep I. So although Daniel Pulse wrote an article a few years ago about the search for the tomb of Amenhotep I, and says fairly early on in that, although he deals with Papyrus Abbott, that we cannot use it in any way as the basis for finding the tomb, and yet he's come up with a tomb that fits at least part of the description, unable to avoid the temptation that Papyrus Abbott can be relied on. So that's another candidate, and there's one last site that we're going to look at today, where we don't yet have a tomb, but we have some tantalizing clues. And those have been provided for us by the splendidly named Polish Clifftop Mission, the mission to Deir el-Bahari. This is led by a colleague of mine, Professor Andrzej Nowinski, director of the mission, an expert in various aspects of ancient Egypt, particularly the funerary material of the 21st dynasty, particularly coffins. It's one of the world's leading experts on material of that time. And he's been excavating improbably in the cliffs, in and around the cliffs above the Deir el-Bahari temples for a number of years here. I used to work, by the way, in an Asasif tomb down in the plain here. It's just a little way beyond the pylon of the temple tomb of Mentu Emhat, Montu Emhat here, 25th dynasty tomb belonging to a man called Harwa. The tomb is subterranean, but we used to have our breakfast just out on the surface here every day, second breakfast at around about 11 o'clock. So every day for about half an hour, I would have the opportunity to stare out across the landscape in the direction of the Hatshepsut temple. And in this direction too, and Professor Nowinski was already working by that time, and I could not believe that it was possible for an excavation to be conducted in the cliffs behind the Hatshepsut temple, because it just appears as though it's almost sheer. But I've visited Professor Nowinski since, when I took this photograph, and some of the others you've seen in this talk. Indeed, it is possible, without too much difficulty, actually, to wander around in the hills here. There are moments when your only route down is on your backside in a cloud of dust. So it's not, it's probably not covered by all the health and safety regulations that you might like, but it's a lot of fun, and it's a lot more possible to work and move around up there than you might think. Professor Nowinski is excavating up in the cliffside. One thing that is difficult about this spot is removing debris away from the area that he wants to clear and work in, and to do that safely. And to do that, he's constructed this incredible pipe made of iron, steel, I don't know, metal barrels, all sort of daisy chained together, which run from his excavations up here all the way down to a spoil dump at the ground level here, making great clattering noise as the material goes down. This would be loose chippings of stone, some bigger than others. So it goes rattling down with a great cacophony of noise, and with lots of dust flying up as well. It's very spectacular, as you can probably see from this. What he's found is, incredibly, a level platform beneath the line of the top of the cliffs. So rather than the cliffs being completely sheer with the odd sort of nodule of rock protruding from the cliffs, there is actually a leveled area up there. You'd never know it from the ground. And on this level, he's found a number of large boulders, which he suggests are not there by accident. They have been, in fact, brought there to conceal something and secure it. And in particular, this is a cemetery area after all. They conceal the entrance to something very important, probably a tomb. He's also found up in this area a number of graffiti naming Buteh Amen. And Buteh Amen he was a scribe, a high-ranking scribe of the later 20th dynasty, very well known, very well attested in graffiti. We also have a coffin associated with him. We know of his house, even. He lived within the temple precinct at Medina Harbi. You can go and visit his house, which has been restored. And he, more than anybody else, appears to be the person associated with the administration and the process of removing mummies from the tombs in the Valley of the Kings and reburying them in the caches. So his graffiti appearing in strategic places associated with the tombs concerned. His coffin bears images of various New Kingdom pharaohs. His own coffin shows various New Kingdom kings on it, not only the kings that he served under, but others as well, suggesting that he has this very particular close relationship with them. So for his name to crop up here strongly suggests that there is some kind of tomb type monument in this area, possibly even a tomb that was inspected during this time. So you can imagine this is of interest. This is Deir Bahari. Of course, this is we're looking sort of face on at the Hatshepsut temple right in front of us here. And this is the very spectacular. These are the very spectacular cliffs behind. This is that pipe that we were looking at earlier of Nowinski's, and his excavations are on the ledges around this sort of area here. So it looks as though it would be impossible to carry out an excavation up here, but he's doing so quite successfully. Probably the single most interesting and important thing that he's found is this item here, which you see against a yellow background. Sorry, this is it might seem like an odd way to display a photograph on a kind of diagonal like this, but I've done it so that it compares well with this second image of a dagger, which is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Brussels. This is a dagger of Kamose, the last king of the 17th dynasty. And although the example found by Nowinski is missing the blade, which would have been, of course, in here, and it's missing this sort of golden disc part of the handle, the rest of it is very strongly reminiscent of this dagger of Kamose. So this we know for sure is a dagger of the end of the 17th dynasty, and on the basis of the form, you would guess that this was possibly a dagger relating to a high status person, the kind of thing that we know was probably buried in the tomb of a high-ranking individual of the end of the 17th dynasty, beginning of the 18th, perhaps. You can see where this is going. Let's just remind ourselves of that inscription in Papyrus Abbott, the description, sorry, I should say, in Papyrus Abbott of the whereabouts of the tomb of Amenhotep I. The eternal horizon of King Djeserkare, the son of Ra Amenhotep, which measures 120 cubits in depth from its stela called Pa'akar, in other words, 120 cubits below a high place, north of the house of Amenhotep of the Garden. Now, naturally, Nowinski's site is certainly some distance below a high place, the top of the cliffs. His site is, depending on where you measure it from, it can be made to fit this description. It can be made to be 120 cubits beneath the high place. So again, you know, we must be cautious in reading into this the precise location of the tomb, but Nowinski's site can be made to fit. Moreover, you may remember that in the temple tomb of Mentuhotep Nebhepet Ra, Naviel, Edouard Naviel, found this very striking statue of Amenhotep I in a funerary pose during the excavations of the EEF. It's now in the British Museum. You might also have noticed these little depressions here either side of the ramp leading up to the platform of the Mentuhotep temple. There's a sort of grid of these circular shapes. These are tree planters. There would have been trees in them, so there would have been a kind of garden area in front of the temple here. And we know that this was in use at the time of Amenhotep I, where the statue was discovered here. This statue's pose evokes the idea of funerary practice, including burial and tombs. There's also another monument of Amenhotep I somewhere in this area. So this was significant for this king, for this time. And Nowinski's site lies, I'm sure you can already guess, approximately, depending on where you measure, approximately north from both where this statue was found, where this garden was, and where the other temple of Amenhotep I is as well. So on both those counts, Nowinski's site can be made to fit that description in Papyrus Abbott. So there we are. We've looked at 4 different candidates for the tomb. So just to recap, the yellow pins, this is a better map, the yellow pins show our various locations. This is KV 39, just a little way beneath the line of the edge of the cliffs, a little way away from the Valley of the Kings. Or is it at the head of the Valley of the Kings, as Ian Buckley and John Rose have argued? In which case, Amenhotep I is the founder of the Valley of the Kings, as far as we can tell. Or is the tomb rather in the area not of his 18th dynasty successors in the valley, but of his 17th dynasty predecessors in the area of Dra Abu el Naga, where we find Howard Carter's tomb A and B, and Daniel Poltz's K93 1112, K93 1112 being, as you can see very clearly on this map, directly north of this temple of Amenhotep I. Or could it be that it is awaiting discovery by Professor Nowinski above the temple of Mentuhotep at Deir el-Bahari, roughly north of the find spot of that very fine statue of Amenhotep I, and the kind of garden that appears to have stood before the Mentuhotep temple? Who knows? And with that, I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. I've overrun a little bit, sorry folks, but I hope you'll forgive me. You're probably expecting it by now. Just before I let you go, I just want to quickly rattle through some other things I wanted to let you know about. You forgive me if you already know all this, or you caught me telling you about this before the talk. My lecture on Cleopatra, which I gave in the end 4 times, just before and after Christmas, was posted to YouTube by the Explorers Club at the end of January. So I thought I'd put a version of the talk, one of the 2 I hosted myself in December, onto my own YouTube channel. So that's up there now if you'd like to watch that or re-watch it. If you do get a chance to visit the channel, there's a number of talks up there now. I'm not going to be putting these talks onto YouTube as a matter of course. I want to focus on giving the events live when we can all be in the room together. But I am putting a few of them up there. And if you want to visit and you get a chance and you haven't already, do please hit the subscribe button. That would be really helpful. So thanks. If you've done that already, thank you very much. If you're going to do that, thanks also. No pressure, of course, but it might well be useful to me if you could do that. The virtual Nile cruise is back, although I'm using a slightly different hashtag for it this time. Delta Deserts. We over the course of 50 consecutive days last year in the early pandemic era, we visited a number of archaeological sites on a kind of virtual Nile cruise, starting in Cairo and ending in Khartoum in Sudan. I was very conscious at that time, although I needed to take a break from it and to concentrate on other things for a bit, that we hadn't by any means covered all the sites in Egypt, and particularly we had missed out on the Delta and the deserts. So now we're back in lockdown. In the UK, at least, I thought it was time to pick things up again. So we are something like, I think today, I haven't done my post for today, but it'll be day 17 today. We're going to be in the desert proper, actually, today at the Valley of the Whales, not Kom el-Hetan, Wadi al-Hetan, in the Western Desert. So we'll be heading around the deserts and oases in the west for the next few days. So do follow that on the socials if that's of interest. I'm doing a Q&A on Saturday for Save Ancient Studies America. This is a Q&A about Egyptologists' notebooks. It's being put on principally for an American audience, I think. So that's why you see the time 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here, but it's freely accessible to anybody. You just need to sign up, I think. The start time will be 7 p.m. I think in the UK. Of course, I'm sure everybody who's neither in the east coast of the US or in the UK will be quite used to doing the calculations. I'm sorry, I don't know what time it will be for all of you. But in any case, the details are on my website, on the online lectures page. Ditto the details for this discussion panel, which I've been invited to join by a new academic journal, Interdisciplinary Egyptology. They're running a session on communicating Egyptology beyond the academe. So I think most of the time interdisciplinary Egyptology will be by and for academic Egyptologists, but this is all about communicating with wider audiences, and so I'm going to be part of that along with Yasmin El-Shazli, Salima Ikram Karakuni, and Fatma Keshk. So that should be lots of fun. They're all friends of mine, and hopefully it'll be an interesting chat. That one's free, as is the Q&A. You just need to register. Again, the details are on my website. So with that, I'll just say thank you very much for coming again. I hope you enjoyed it today. I hope I've left you pondering the question of whether or not we have found the tomb of Amenhotep I, and if so, where it is. You know the drill, I think, most of you. Just for anybody who hasn't been to one of my talks before, I'm going to stick around now for 15-20 minutes, or perhaps a bit longer if we need it. If there are questions or points that people want to make, or suggestions or comments, if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A box first of all. I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier, but I'll go to the Q&A box first to take the questions, and then once we've got through all those, I'll go back to the chat and take any questions that have popped up there. So just to say thanks again, folks. Hope you enjoyed it, and over to questions. Arthur, hello, Arthur. Nice to see you. Arthur asks, was Arpep the actual name of the Hyksos king, or was that what the Egyptians call him, given Arpep's role in being the opponent of Ra? That's a good question. So we might expect a foreigner to have a foreign name. In this case, I don't know whether Arpep claimed an Egyptian word as his name, or whether his name, in whatever language was his own, was just suitably close enough to the name of the Egyptian god that the two got conflated. I don't know that. I wonder if anybody else has got any more knowledge on that. There is a text, of course, which tends to be called the Quarrel of Apophis and Seqenen-Re, or something like that, which is a kind of allegorical story in which Seqenen-Re complains about his noisy neighbor in the north, which is clearly an allegory for the antipathy between the 17th Dynasty line and the Seqenen-Re Ta'ar, and the Hyksos king is under Apophis. But I don't know. That's something for me to take a note and look into. Thanks. Good question, Arthur. And the second one, KV35 is the site for a second mummy cache. Seems a strange choice, given that one of the aims of moving the royal dead was the inability to ensure the security of the Valley of the Kings. Yeah, I agree, Arthur. I know exactly what you're getting at. So folks, you're probably also already following this line of thinking. There are two caches, one of which is in a very anonymous, a very well hidden tomb in an otherwise unoccupied corner of the Theban necropolis. TT 320 seems like a very good place to hide in secret a load of royal mummies. And the other one is right slap bang in the same place where we know the robberies were taking place previously. So that seems like a daft place to try to hide mummies from that point of view. I absolutely see what you mean, and we don't really understand that, but I suppose you can at least say that it would be easier to secure mummies in one place than it would be to try and guard lots of different places. So maybe the thinking was, for one reason or another, the tomb of Amenhotep II is a tomb that we can secure. So let's put a bunch of mummies in there, and then we'll just put every guard we've got at the doorway to that tomb, and hope that those mummies aren't robbed again. Of course, the other thing which I didn't really talk about very much in this talk is that we know now, or the consensus view now is, thanks to Nicholas Reeves' research on this, research he did for his PhD thesis actually in the 1970s and early 80s, that rather than the royal mummies in the caches being found with almost no grave goods because the grave goods had been robbed, it seems more likely that while some things had been robbed, the authorities themselves stripped away the rest of the grave goods in order to recycle precious materials and reclaim their value for the ailing Egyptian economy. Basically, Nick has shown that we do have evidence for specific instances of robbery, and there aren't very many of them. And when we can see it, we don't see evidence of very much having been taken. So we need to look for another explanation, and maybe that's what it is. So, of course, by removing all of the precious materials, the authorities would also be disincentivizing robbers. What's the point in violating KV35 only to find a load of wooden coffins and moldy old mummies in there? No gold, no unguents, no oils, no easily stealable things like jewelry, or not very much anyway. So I agree, it's a bit odd, but perhaps that was the thinking, is that they could defend one tomb. They were comfortable, they could do that. And after all, they succeeded, at least until Victor Loret came onto the tomb in whenever it was, 1892, I think. Good question. I'd definitely like to do more on this. I think maybe a talk on this subject if we haven't already covered all the ins and outs of it. I think it's really fascinating. One aspect of it, which is really fascinating, is that although we have almost all the mummies of the New Kingdom pharaohs in those two caches, there are some conspicuous absences, including the mummies of I and Horemheb of the end of the 18th dynasty, whose tombs are known. So what happened to them, we don't know. Ramesses VIII, whose tomb is not known. I think I'm right in saying that he's not in the caches. Anyway, the absence of I and Horemheb suggests that there might be another cache that we haven't found yet. Anne asks, what's the status of Professor Nowinski's excavations? That's an interesting question. I last saw Professor Nowinski in October 2019. I was in Egypt with a group, and there was an announcement that day. I think there's at least one person. I think Carl, you may have been there. There was an announcement at the time we were in the area, Del Bahari area, of the discovery of a load of coffins, something like 26, in a single deposit in the Asasif. And some of these coffins were placed out in a tent very close to the Temple of Hatshepsut, within sight of it. And a press conference was held, and we were able to go along and see the coffins, which was amazing. And Nowinski was there. Everybody was at that press conference, and Nowinski was there, and I said hi. And he was in the middle of his work, and as always, very optimistic that he's going to make a discovery soon. I don't know what effect the pandemic has had on his work. I assume it's meant that he hasn't been able to go out probably since autumn 2019, but it's still very much an ongoing project. There is, as usual, folks, by the way, I'll try to put my slides and some notes on this up onto the web in the next few days, should you want to follow up any of these things. There's a lecture online on YouTube by Professor Nowinski about his work. So rather than just hearing about it from me, you can hear it from the horse's mouth. It's a lecture from a few years ago now, but it is still, I think you'll find it very interesting. He's a real character, so it's definitely worth watching his talk. Kaylee says, sorry, I had to deal with an 8-year-old refusing bed and missed a bit. What was the Scorsese film you were talking about? Yes, sorry to hear you had to miss a bit, Kaylee. The film is called The Night of Counting the Years. The Egyptian name is Al-Mumia, but the English title is The Night of Counting the Years. So if you Google Night of Counting the Years, the last time I looked anyway, you should find a link where you can, there are probably various versions online actually, but it is freely accessible online. And one of those allows you to download the movie and the subtitles. So it's not quite as straightforward as finding it on Netflix, but yes, works. Oh, and I now realise that Peter has answered the question, so I needn't have gone waffling on for ages. Anyway, thanks, Peter, and thanks for the question, Katie. I hope you find it, and everybody, if you haven't seen it already, I really recommend it. Angie says, I missed the first half hour as Zoom played out. I'm sorry to hear that, Angie. Will this be recorded? Angie, if you drop me a line, I will, I'll see what I can do. This one is recording, I think, automatically, so that probably should be possible, folks. If ever you miss one of these, as I say, I don't want to make these talks sort of generally and freely available, because I'm very aware that you've signed up and made the time to be here today and paid your fees and everything. But if you ever sign up and then are unable to see the talk for one or two reasons, I had 2 people get in touch with me yesterday to say that they had their vaccination appointments suddenly, which meant they couldn't come to the talk. That's a feature of life these days. There are ways for me to provide you with a recording afterwards. As I say, I don't want to make them generally publicly available quite yet, but there are ways. So if you ever have an issue, let me know, and there's usually a way. Mary says perhaps that last cache is above Hatshepsut's temple here. The excavation found large stones placed to conceal a tomb. Yeah, I mean, Professor Nowinski is absolutely convinced and has been for a long time that there is something up there. And I think it's probably fair to say that he's had a lot of skepticism from colleagues. And it's also fair to say that he hasn't found a tomb yet. But he has found a whole lot more than I think anybody thought he was going to. I don't think anybody really suspected there was any evidence of human activity up there in the cliffs. And he's got graffiti, he's got cultural objects, he's got evidence of landscaping. Whether or not these boulders are concealing what he thinks, we don't know. And I know that he's had at least one of them smashed and removed, and it proved not to conceal anything. But who knows? Never say never. Carl asks, were most of the mummies from the Deir el-Bahari cache known to have come originally from the King's Valley? Were any definitely not from KB? Yeah, yes, they were. I mean, we have no reason not to think that the mummies of the New Kingdom pharaohs were not originally placed in the tombs that were built for those kings. So, other than the exceptions I mentioned, Horemheb, I think Ramesses VIII, but now I'm saying that I want to go and check it. Ramesses XI's body has not been found, but we assume that he was buried in the north, in Tanis, because his authority only extended to that area by the end of his reign. Everybody else, I think, is represented in the caches. Oh, Amana pharaohs aside as well, including Amenhotep I, and a number of the 17th Dynasty kings as well. Second Enrei included. His mummy was found in DB 320. So yeah, assuming they were originally placed in the tombs that were cut for them, then they certainly came from there. But in the mix are a number of other individuals. The KV35 cache is almost entirely pharaohs. Then you've got the three enigmatic unwrapped mummies: elder lady, younger lady, and the young male individual. There's another young male individual who was found in a corridor, I think, there. That's very much the smaller cache. DB 320 is much the bigger one, and of the 50, something like 10 or 12, I think, I should know the number, but it's something in that region, were pharaohs. There's a number of royal family members, but there's also a number of high-ranking 21st dynasty individuals, including a number of chief priests of Ammon, some of whom had the authority of kings in the Theban region at the time, but we've got no reason to think that they were originally buried in the Valley of the Kings. It seems that it also seems unlikely that they were buried first in the Deir el-Bahari cache. It seems more likely that they had their own tombs, which were then threatened for some reason, and they were reburied in the cache. And if that's right, then maybe those priests were buried in King's Valley tombs, but it seems more likely they were buried elsewhere. I'm just trying to think of other clear examples of individuals who were buried definitely in other tombs. I'm not sure. It might be that some of the people buried in the Queen's Valley, also their bodies ultimately made their way into the caches. I'm not completely sure. But the point still stands. Across the two caches, you've got kings, other royal family members, kings who were definitely buried in the Valley of the Kings, other royal family members, and then you've got non-royals who were presumably buried elsewhere in the necropolis. I think I really must do another talk on this. That'll give me a good reason to go and be a bit more sure about numbers and things. Arthur says KB57 contained a collection of disarticulated mummies, which, if they were not from later intrusive burials, might be what remains of another cache. Yes, you're right, Arthur. Yes, you are right. Yes, Geoffrey Martin did some work re-clearing 57, didn't he? Which turned up some additional material that was missed by Ayrton and co. when they found that tomb in 1908, 7, 8, something like that. Yes, you're right. Actually, yes. It's possible they were there. It's also possible that if I and Horemheb were caught up in the Amarna heresy, I certainly was, Horemheb possibly not, but they might also have suffered the same fate as the other Amarna royals. At least one of whom, Queen T, was unceremoniously reburied in KV35. So perhaps that his association with Amarna may explain why we don't have I's body. Joanne asks, or says, do you think that artifacts that were stolen could still come to light, passed on as heirlooms or stored in security boxes around the world, but could be identified to any individuals or just decorative? It is possible. Yeah, it is possible, Joanne. I think one of the things about the Royal Cache Tomb is that we, as I mentioned in the talk, we don't know when the Abderrassoul brothers first found it. There are some things which we are sure came from the cache, but we don't know exactly what they had found and sold. So a good example of how we have, with a lot of detective work, been able to retrospectively put back some of the things that that they removed is the mummy that's been identified as Ramesses I. That's now on display in the Luxor Museum. It was for many years in a museum in Niagara, as in Niagara Falls in Canada. It was noticed about 20 years ago that mummy was apparently a mummy which on various bases could be said to be a New Kingdom pharaoh. And there aren't many of those that are missing. Ramesses I being one of them at that time, and tracing back how the mummy had come to be in Niagara, it was purchased by a Scot, if I remember rightly, on behalf of a Canadian. One or the other or both of these individuals was a doctor, and they purchased it from a man called Mustafa Aga Khan, I think, who was the local headman in Luxor and acted on as a sort of unofficial British consul in Luxor. He was also a broker for antiquities deals. So if you wanted to buy stuff, you went to see Mustafa Aga Khan. Amelia Edwards did, Marianne Brocklehurst did, and lots of other people did as well. And if you had something in particular in mind, you could go to this chap, and whether he had something like that or not, he had people he could talk to who could then go and get what you wanted. And so it seems that either the Scot or the Canadian gave the message to this guy that they wanted a mummy, and it seems that this mummy appeared, it was purchased, it eventually made its way to Canada, and it eventually made its way into the Niagara Museum. And we know that the Abderrassoul brothers were among the people who Mustafa Aga Khan would talk to if he wanted monuments. He wanted things that he could sell. And the mummy was purchased in the years, in around exactly the right time when we think the Abderrassoul brothers had found the cache. So most probably, this is in between the time when they discovered it and it was cleared by the Antiquities Service. So most probably what happened is that Mustafa Aga Khan got the message that he wanted a mummy. He spoke to the Abderrassoul brothers, possibly among others. They said, yes, no problem, we can help you. They went to the Royal Cache, they took out a mummy, brought it to Mustafa Aga Khan, it was sold. And it's only a century and more later that somebody said, hang on, that looks like a royal mummy. And we now think probably that was one of the things that they had discovered and sold. And we don't know what other things there might have been, and what other things might have come out of other tombs in other places. But it is certainly true that from time to time, things which have lain in museum cases or in basements or in somebody's loft or in a cardboard box turn out to be something very important. I was just looking yesterday when I was at the Ashmolean at the Shrine of Taharqa from Kawa, which is in the middle of the Egyptian galleries, or the Egyptian and Sudanese galleries in the Ashmolean. They've installed now inside the shrine, so that you can see it, a really beautiful hard stone statue about half life size of King Taharqa, a cult statue of King Taharqa. It's really beautiful. This was only identified, again, around about 20 years ago, a little bit less, in the basement of a museum in Southampton. The keeper of the Egyptian department at the British Museum at the time, Vivian Davis, was visiting for some reason, and came across this statue and said, hang on, that looks like a statue of a pharaoh, an extremely fine statue of a pharaoh. So it still belongs to the Southampton Museum, but it's now on display in the Ashmolean. So these things do happen. Yeah. So take care when you're next in your loft, or somebody else's loft, or clearing a house, or looking in a junk shop, or whatever. Keep your eyes peeled. You never know what you might find. Thanks. Great question, Joanne. Thank you. Long answer. I hope that was okay. Martin says, is there any more material on TT293 on the EES website? I don't think there will be on the EES website, Martin. Where you need to go is Porter and Moss. If you Google Porter and Moss, if you Google Porter and Moss, you will find the part of the Griffith Institute, University of Oxford website, which is devoted to the topographical bibliography of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic texts, reliefs, paintings, something else. And you want the very first volume in the sequence, volume 1, part 1, which is the Theban necropolis private tombs, and the tombs are listed in order. So if you go in there and look up number 293, the information will be a little bit out of date now, but it's still the best place to look for such things. You'll find basic description, and then sources of further information, archival sources and published sources. And you might find a plan. The other thing to do would be just to Google it. Google TT293. There are other books which will give you information, but as a starting point, Porter and Moss. If you have access to Friederike Kamp's Thebanische Necropole volume, that's brilliant, but that'll be hard to get hold of, I should think. So Porter and Moss, freely accessible online, and Google. I don't know what Google will tell you, but that's a good starting point. There is a website which was put together by two guys in the last few years as well. What's it called? It's something like OsirisNet or Osiris Web, and that's a list, a load of pages devoted to particular tombs. They don't do all of the Theban tombs. They don't do all of them, but you might be lucky to TT293 might be one of them. I'd be a bit surprised actually, but you never know. Oh, and you could also try the DAI, German Archaeological Institute website, Deutschen Archäologischen Instituts Cairo, I think. Forgive me my terrible German. If you look on there, under the Cairo office section, I think you'll find Daniel Poltz's excavations at Triab al-Naga. There might be a bit more there. And I'll try and put these things up onto the page online as well. Arthur says, has the Niagara mummy been as scientifically verified as far as possible as a KN mummy? I guess you mean KV mummy. I'm not sure, Arthur. I'm not sure. I don't think it's been DNA tested. And there's lots of controversy around the DNA, but if it had been tested, you would look for connections with the mummies of Ramesses II, Seti I, etc., who are known to be related, from the Egyptian evidence, known to be related to Ramesses I. I don't think that's been done, but I don't know that. The Niagara mummy looks a bit gracile to be the progenitor of the lantern-jawed Ramessites. Maybe they get their lantern jaw from the mum's side. Maybe. I don't know. Oh, Mary Banks says osirisnet.net. Brilliant. Thanks, Mary. That's what I was thinking of. Yeah, Martin, if you check osirisnet.net for TT293, you might find some more info. I'd be a bit surprised, but you may find a bit more. Okay, folks, that's the end. I've got to the end of the questions. Thank you all for all of those. It's always fun to think a bit more about these various things. I'm just going to head over to the chat, see if anybody else has got anything more to say. Oh, and you have. Thanks everybody for your nice comments. I'm not gonna go through all of these. I'm not going to read them all out one by one. But thank you. It's always lovely to hear that the lecture's been appreciated. So thank you very much, Angie. I think we've already Angela Dennett. I think we've already said. But in case not, do drop me a line one way or another if you did miss a bit of the talk, and we'll see if we can find this out. Arthur says, knowing the cussedness of Egyptian archaeology, none of these will turn out to be Amenhotep the First, and it'll be found somewhere else. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that the Ahmose monument for a long time at Abydos, almost everybody, I think the consensus view still is that it's a cenotaph, it's not a tomb. But I noticed that Aidan, in his Royal Tombs of Egypt book, really brilliant Royal Tombs of Egypt book, speculates that, you know, maybe it is, maybe the Ahmose monument at Abydos is his tomb. We also know that although Ahmose's monument there, and that pyramid is the last Egyptian royal pyramid, there are of course royal pyramids of Kushite kings in Sudan. It's the last Egyptian royal pyramid we know of, but there are textual references to a pyramid of Thutmose I. And if this was a trend that was maybe started by Ahmose but lasted until Thutmose I, then one wonders whether or not Amenhotep I did similar and had a pyramid that just hasn't survived for one reason or another. And if so, and if Ahmose's pyramid complex is the place of his tomb, then maybe Amenhotep was buried at Abydos as well. That is total speculation. There's no evidence for that whatsoever, but it's not impossible. Maureen says, a fascinating way to spend a freezing Thursday morning. Thanks, Maureen. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Paula says, fascinating. Statue of Amenhotep I is very similar in style to the famous one of Mentuhotep in the BM. Interesting that Hatshepsut and Amenhotep I would both seek to link with their predecessor. Yeah, that is interesting. You're right. There are a number of those Mentuhotep statues. The most famous one is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, or at least it was. I don't know where it might be now. Grand Egyptian Museum, perhaps. There are a number of those, and in fact we found one where I was working with the Italian archaeological mission in TT37, only the lower half of it, and it was upside down in the debris. It was brilliant because as soon as we started to reveal it in the excavations, the first thing we saw were those massive toes, which are really characteristic of those Mentuhotep statues. It's not, it is sort of similar, isn't it? I know what you mean. Similar material, same material, sandstone. And the Amenhotep statue is standing and in the Osirid pose. Mentuhotep is typically seated. But yeah, similarities, I know what you mean. I think the fact that there's been so much focus on the Hatshepsut temple from the end of the 19th century onwards has really blinded us to what was happening elsewhere. I mean, it's really interesting, for example, that the tomb of Harwar TT37 is built not on alignment with the Hatshepsut temple, but it's aligned with the Mentuhotep temple. There's a causeway of both temples which runs right the way down to the valley, the cultivation. Neither of them really survived to any extent. You certainly, the Hatshepsut causeway is invisible now. I guess it must be under the tarmac. But the Mentuhotep causeway is visible in the Asasif, and it runs right past the entrance to TT37. And you can imagine that, you know, until more recently, or perhaps at the point at which, since the point at which the Hatshepsut temple came to be used as a monastery, the Deir, which gives its name to the area, Deir al-Bahari, the monastery of the north, perhaps the Mentuhotep temple was much, much more important than we realized. It's the fact that we just don't see it now that blinds us to it. Pamela says, much food for thought. We probably all have our opinion of which it might be, probably all different. Yeah, I think so. I like that sort of uncertainty and discussion. Gets us thinking, doesn't it? Oh, lots of nice comments. Thank you all. Arthur says 1898. Arthur, was that the discovery of KB35? have I got? I was miles out. I said 1892, didn't I? Thank you. Oh, Martin's found the movie. Martin's found Night of Counting the Years, folks. There's a YouTube link in the chat if you're interested in going to the movie. Buteh Ammon was not above Deir al-Bahri for nothing. Arthur says, yeah, exactly. John says, the danger of attending your talks is that when I finally get to Egypt, I'll know more than the guide. That's nice of you to say, John. I think it depends on your guide. Some are very, very good. Some not so good. Some are very good. Yeah, Arthur, thank you. Yes, when Laurie discovered the tomb. So, folks, I got that wrong. Forgive me. Victor Laurie discovered the tomb of Amenhotep II, KV35 in 1898, not 1892. As I said, I should know this. There's a section on Laurie in my notebooks book. I've forgotten already. Martin says, I don't know why, but since I played Assassin's Creed Origins, I picture a Ben stone in the middle of the precincts of Amenhotep. I think it's a pyramid in the game, isn't it, Martin? I think. Yeah. Just send Chris's YouTube channel link to the guide, John. Oh, I'm not sure they'd like that. But again, it depends on your guide, probably. Anyway, folks, I think we're at the end of the questions. We're at the end of the chat. I've probably taken up too much of your time already. So I will just say thanks again for coming, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. I did. There will be more talks on the way. As you know, there's the Q&A and the panel discussion and various other things. Virtual Nile will be continuing. I want to get to 30 days of Delta and Deserts, because 30 days there will, when added to the 50 days of Virtual Nile cruise last year, will give us not quite 80 days around the world, but 80 days around Egypt and Sudan, which seems like a nice round number. So that's going to keep me busy for a bit, but there will be more talks on the way, so keep an eye out for those, and I hope to see you at another one of those soon. So thanks again for coming. Thanks all for your very nice comments and for your questions. As I say, I'll try and get some notes and further reading up online in the next few days. If I can, I'll post a little announcement as and when I'm able to do that online. And otherwise, I hope to see you next time. So thanks, folks, again, and stay safe and well. See you soon. Bye.